Hello, and welcome back to Off the Deaton Path. I'm Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society, and we welcome you to this podcast for September 12th, 2024. We are recording this week from the Good Government Division here at the Georgia Historical Society on the 15th floor of the Jepson House overlooking beautiful Forsyth Park in downtown Savannah. My very special guest this week is historian and author Greg Brooking. Greg earned a PhD in history from Georgia State University, a master's in history from Georgia College and State University, and a bachelor's degree in history from Mercer University. He has published articles in the Georgia Historical Quarterly and the Journal of the American Revolution, and he has held fellowships and grants from the Society of the Cincinnati, the American Philosophical Society, the Clements Library at the University of Michigan, the David Library of the American Revolution, and George Washington's Mount Vernon, among many others. Greg teaches at North Springs High School in Sandy Springs, Georgia, where he has taught social studies for 9 years, and he previously taught for 7 years at Kennesaw State University. Greg's latest publication, and the one he is here to talk about with me today, is a terrific new book entitled From Empire to Revolution, Sir James Wright and the Price of Loyalty in Georgia, published on July 15th of this year by the University of Georgia Press as part of an ongoing series entitled Early American Places. The book was reviewed very favorably in the Wall Street Journal in the July 16th edition earlier this year. Greg is an old and dear friend, and I'm very pleased to have him on this podcast. My conversation with Greg Brooking begins now. Greg Brooking, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
First, before we get started, first thing I'm going to ask you to do is to tell our listeners who may not know, just sort of give us a thumbnail sketch of who James Wright is. But before you do that, I want to ask you about, you were one of the lucky few people who got to see your book reviewed. Not only, I know the academic journal reviews are coming out and will come out, but your book got reviewed in the prestigious Wall Street Journal. How did that happen? What can you tell us about that? And congratulations.
Thanks. I'm happy that it came out. Obviously, it was a nice review in a prestigious journal, as you said. It was totally unbeknownst to me. I was on fellowship at the Society of the Cincinnati in Washington, D.C., and right after I got my computer unpacked and ready to start researching, I got an email from the marketing department at UGA Press with a link. So I learned about it, I guess, probably about the same time everyone else did, or could have anyway, online.
And you were pleased with that, with the review?
Yeah, I thought it was very nice. The gentleman made a couple of points that I was really pleased to see that my point of view came across well in the book, and that was namely that it wasn't a hagiographic look at Wright. It wasn't a condemnation of loyalism or a condemnation of Whig or patriotism. It was a complex war, and it seems that came across.
Yeah, very nuanced, exactly. So for the benefit of our listeners who don't know colonial Georgia history or even revolutionary Georgia history as well as you and I do and are fascinated by it, tell them, if you will, give us a thumbnail sketch. Who was James Wright?
Gosh, in the thumbnail, James Wright was Georgia's third and final colonial governor. He came to Georgia from London, although he had spent much of his childhood and his adult life in Charleston. He was born in London, but then his family migrated to Charleston. He went back to London to become a colonial agent for the colony of South Carolina, and from there he was appointed governor of Georgia. And so he spent 21 of the final 27 years of his life in Georgia, going back to England twice, once for a 2-year period, and then once for another 2-year period after he was banished from Georgia at the onset of the Revolution.
What did it mean in 1760 to be governor of a colony like Georgia? We sort of think about the governorship today as something that every 4 years we're asked to vote on, but you just said he held the position for basically 22 years. What did it mean? What were some of the things that a colonial governor did or didn't do?
Well, it was a prestigious position for him. It came with an annual salary of £1,000. which was a fairly astronomical number during that time period. It allowed him, in fact, to purchase ultimately 11 plantations, and he enslaved well over 500 human beings. By the time of the Revolution, he had 525 humans on his paperwork from which he hoped to be indemnified if he should have lost them to the rebels. He was answerable only to essentially the king, but the king through his ministers. And he was in charge of, he was the commander in chief. He negotiated, in his case, two huge land cessions with the Native Americans, one in 1763 and then one in 1773, which greatly augmented both Georgia's geography and population. And aside from that, he had to maintain a working relationship with the colonial legislature, both the House of Commons and the Georgia Commons House, which was an elected legislature. But he also got to appoint members to the governor's royal council. And so from those positions, he was able to pass out patronage to enable him to govern better, but also to enable him to ingratiate himself with the people that he wanted to ingratiate himself with, which was usually the planter class and the merchant class.
So certainly not an elected position as governor at that time.
Not at all.
Presumably he would be kept in as long as he both A, wanted to serve, and B, was doing well representing the king. Correct.
Yeah. And he, at about 1770, he wanted to return to England. And it turns out, in previous historians that have studied his career hadn't come to this conclusion, but he went back to London, hopefully to retire and to receive some other appointment, more prestigious appointment. Georgians thought he went to London to obtain the second land cession that was eventually signed in 1773. But he planned to stay in London. He had already started selling off some of his properties, advertising for others. He was convinced to return to Georgia in 1773 with the honor of receiving a baronetcy from King George III. So he became Sir James Wright at that point.
So let's back up a little bit. Now that you've told us who he was, how did you come to land on this topic? You know, I don't mind telling you, when I first got to the Georgia Historical Society in 1998, I thought that I would, I thought, I'd like to write a book, and nobody's ever written a biography of James Wright. That might be a nice thing to do. And that kind of just went by the wayside. And in part because of what we think of as the lack of traditional sources for writing a biography. So if you will, take our listeners through how you first got interested in Wright, and then how you decided to navigate the shoals of writing a biography of somebody for whom there aren't a lot of the traditional sources.
Well, you and I weren't the first to think about writing a biography of Wright. Back in 1956, give me a couple of years here, give or take. Famous, in my mind, famous Georgia, University of Georgia historian Kenneth Coleman, who was, in my mind, one of the deans, if not the dean of colonial Georgia history, maybe with Ed Cashin. He was thinking of writing a biography, and in his papers at the Hardgrit Library at UGA, there is a letter between him and Trevor Reese, who was also a historian of colonial Georgia, but living in England or Great Britain. And he's mentioning, I want to do this, but the sources, as you mentioned, are so scattered and so incomplete. I got interested in Wright as I was studying for my PhD at Georgia State about 13 years ago, and wanted to research the Revolution because that was the area that I enjoyed the most. And for a PhD, as you know, you have to write some original research. It can't be something that anyone else has written. And so I decided to write about James Wright. No one had written about him. I had spoken with Robert Calhoun, who was a great historian of loyalism in America, and some other folks, local Georgia historians at Georgia College, Aunt Leanne Caldwell, and some others. And they said that's a worthy topic, and so I moved forward. I also was thinking that it would be a local topic, so that I wouldn't have to travel too terribly far to find materials. And as you mentioned, the dearth of traditional sources that we like to see, you know, it made that project much more difficult than I had hoped that it would initially be. Of course, I went to Great Britain. I spent time on fellowship in New York and in Boston and Philadelphia a couple of times, 3 times, I think, in Philadelphia, back and forth between the Georgia Historical Society, the Georgia Archives, South Carolina Historical Society, and South Carolina Archives, because he spent, half of his adult life in Charleston and half in Savannah.
Mm-hmm.
And the biggest hindrance to anybody writing, and I would imagine that I would have had to chosen a different topic had this not happened, was that all of his personal correspondence was destroyed at the Battle of the Rice Boats in Savannah at the beginning of the American Revolution, as he made his escape from Savannah. And so without all of that personal correspondence, I was afraid, and I guess everybody before me has been afraid, that it would be really difficult to cobble together a true full portrait of him. And so hopefully I was able to do that with the professional correspondence, as well as private correspondence of those people around him, those that lived in Savannah and then those that lived across the ocean as well.
Yeah, and just for our listeners, really what we're talking about is there is not a big cache of papers somewhere that you could dive into that sort of would allow you to take him from cradle to grave, as it were, and to give us the kind of insights into his personality maybe that we would like to have. We know a lot about Jefferson and Washington, and not just the great things they did, the big public things, but we know, for instance, the things that irritated them, or the things that got under their skin, or even how they like to pass the time.
Mm-hmm.
And for the most part, I think it's safe to say those things are missing for Wright. Is that correct?
100%. Yeah,
Yeah.
100%. The only glimpses into his personal life, and he was very um, uh, proper. He understood rank, and he understood deference, and he understood his position, and he expected that from those that he deemed below him in society. But he did not let his personal interfere with his professional and his correspondence really at all. It wasn't until he started filing paperwork with the Loyalist Commission after Britain lost the war. He did this actually during the war, but that loyalists in Georgia and across the new United States filed paperwork to be repaid for their loyalty, all the things that they had lost, whether it be jobs, cash, houses, so plantations, so on and so forth. That we start to see some of his personal life creep into that. So that's how I know about the number of enslaved people that he had, a relationship that he had with one enslaved woman on his plantation, whom nobody knew about until I was able to, with the help of a genealogist. I want to give a couple of quick shout outs, if I can, to
Please.
3 genealogists who have helped me a great deal. The late, great Mary Bondurant Warren, who is the queen of all of Georgia colonial genealogy. Kenneth Thomas from Decatur, who is fantastic. And then Sandra Bowling transcribed James Wright's will for me. And if you've never read an 18th century will, don't think you're going to pick one up and read it, because I have no idea what it said. But she was able to translate it for me. And James Wright had a woman that he called a servant that apparently came with him from Savannah to London. And upon his death, he wanted his family and his estate to provide her an annual indemnity of £10 a year and find her a place to live. And so those kinds of things come about in his loyalist claims. But there is not a single private letter from there's no letter from him to or from a private citizen outside of maybe a James Habersham. And James Habersham was on the Royal Council, so even that could be considered professional as well as personal.
I was going to ask you about Habersham was one of his best friends, I guess, here in Savannah.
Yeah, I
And
would say if I was going to classify, I would say the best friends.
yeah, and we can presume that they may have written letters back and forth to each other. I mean, even some things that say, wow, it's a hot summer here, and so something like that. I will say, yeah, Wright was scrupulously formal in his writings back to London, as you point out, often complaining, bitterly complaining in some cases,
Yes.
but I think he had a lot to complain about. So how would you, I mean, you spent all this time with him and you delved through all of the archives. And I do want to ask you some questions about the archives and what you did look at and how you were able to piece this together. But at the end of the day, did you feel like you knew him as a person or as a or is that too much? I mean, I know you must have felt like you knew him as a administrator and as a royal administrator, somebody who was doing a job. But how would you what words would you use to describe him? And it's a two-part question. The words you'd use to describe him, and what do you feel like you knew him after all this?
Aloof, formal, conscientious, prepared, professional, acquisitive. He sought power and he sought wealth and riches. I know him? Boy, that's a great question. And my first blush was yes. I do think I know much of him. I don't at all know as much as I wanted to know of him, but I may know more than what readers would want to know of him. I think I could very much accurately describe his personality with broad strokes. But like you say, the personal letters that tell me about who he was outside of, quote unquote, business hours remains so elusive. I mean, there is not even one letter. His wife and he lost a wife and two daughters at sea in 1764. They were going to London for his wife to introduce his eldest daughter to English society, and she was getting engaged to William Knox, who was from Georgia or lived in Georgia, and was somewhat of a major player in Britain during the American Revolution, from behind the scenes. But they were lost at sea, and he kept. He didn't say it, but Habersham. We have some James Habersham letters in which he writes to his daughter, and of course she never receives it because she perished at sea, saying that your dad is hoping you're well, and so on and so forth, and now it's been 6 months since we haven't heard from you, and now we're all starting to worry. And James Habersham had recently lost his wife by 1764. And in one of his letters to James Wright's daughter, he mentions, or I don't know, after the fact, he's writing to someone else mentioning that he and James Wright are living together, for some short period of time, I think, so they can just kind of both emotionally take care of each other and the losses that they've endured. But there's not one single letter that Wright has written that's extant that discusses this. He lost a daughter in 1761 at sea when he was coming from London to Charleston to become the governor of Georgia, and there's no letter, from him that says anything about it. And so I really fear that, as I mentioned, everything personal was lost at sea as he tried to escape the rebels in Georgia in 1776.
Yeah, I was going to ask you to talk about that tragedy of losing his wife, and unimaginable, and yet somehow he just sort of got on with it. But it must have been devastating for him, one imagines.
Had to be, because you can see in his letters to British ministers during the Revolutionary War, he's trying to acquire positions for his sons, his elder sons, in the British Army, and he speaks so passionately about his sons. It is one obvious that he spoiled his children in his letters. He says, I've suggested that he get involved in the merchant trade, and this is he says this is below his station. So the kids, it seems, were spared, or this one child anyway, not spared but spoiled. This one child anyway was certainly spoiled, and so he seems very much to me a family man. He never remarried, and that's the final 23 years of his life. He was still in his quote unquote prime. He had, I think, 4 young children in 1764, certainly below the age of maturity. And it was so common for men to remarry quickly if they had young children at home that needed to be taken care of, but he did not. So that gives me more reason to think that the tragedy was deeply felt.
Yeah, and he was only in his 40s at that time, I think.
Yeah. He was born in 1716.
Born in 1716. So you mentioned he was born in London, but at a young age. His father was, I think, appointed, remind me, is it something like Chief Justice in South Carolina or something like that? They came out to Charleston.
Chief Justice in South Carolina. He was appointed in 1725, and they arrived here being Charleston, in 1725. But because of the political struggles between the South Carolina legislature and their lords proprietors, and then the switch between lord proprietors and the royal government, the king, he didn't actually take position until 1730. So they lived here 5 years without Dad, serving in the capacity in which he was chosen to serve.
And so take us through Wright's career before he gets to Georgia, if you will. Because he, as you mentioned, he spent a great deal of time in South Carolina, amassing a pretty good fortune there too, right?
Yeah, he was something of a well-connected wonder kid. It seems like he born in 1716. He arrives in Charleston at 9 in 1725. Elizabeth Hearn wrote a letter, the only letter we know that connected the Wrights in their arrival, and she says that they must be important because he's come with livery and 400 or 500 English pounds with him, and so Dad had money upon his arrival. Now, there's a great story about Dad that we were able to uncover in researching this, that it appears that Dad lived 2 lives. One in London with James Wright's mother, and one in the outskirts of London with his father's wife. So he seems to have had 2 households that he shared. And it seems to me, my bet is that he came to Charleston, South Carolina, to escape the discovery of those 2 houses, and to provide for his children without having their inheritances questioned because they were bastard children. But so James Wright's in South Carolina in 1725. At the age of 9, about 10 years later, he is already in the South Carolina colonial records as serving as the temporary colonial attorney general for the colony of South Carolina. He would do that on and off as a temporary expedient for the attorney general who had left, who had gone on leave. And then under his own right, he served in that position until 1747, so a little more than a decade. At some point during that time, he was admitted to Gray's Inn, one of the famous inns of London. There is no record at Gray's Inn of him ever having matriculated. I, in fact, contacted Gray's London to see if maybe they had, records that I didn't have access to, and they did a thorough search, and they said that he never matriculated. They also told me that in the 18th century it was not uncommon for someone to enroll, pay the fees, and be admitted to the bar. And so
And
it
this would be
appeared.
the equivalent of a modern law school, right? It's somebody going to
Right,
law
right,
school. Yeah.
yes, the Gray's Inn. Thank you. And so he didn't appear to go to this law school. Rather, I imagine being around his father, who was a competent lawyer and judge, and others. He was able to learn the practice, and that's how most people learn the practice here in America. Anyway, was not by going to a law school, but by being given books to read and then asked questions about them later. Um, there's also proof that makes it very difficult to suggest that he went to London during this time period. During the time period supposedly in which he was in London to get his law degree, he marries in Charleston, and he is constantly in the Charleston papers for all but about a 6 month period during that 10-year stretch. And so it just seems inconceivable that he actually went to Gray's Inn. And that's if you look up, or if you go to Wikipedia and you look up James Wright, they all say he attended the famous Gray's Inn. But he did not do that. But he had a very practical training in the law, and was the number is going to escape me now because I've been working on another project for the last year. He was one of the top 2 or 3 paid attorneys in colonial South Carolina history, with his private firm or business as well as his professional. So he was qualified and he was respected as an attorney in South Carolina. He leaves South Carolina in 1757 when he's appointed colonial agent to London for South Carolina. And a colonial agent is like a lobbyist. They speak for the interests of whatever colony it is that they represent. For example, Benjamin Franklin, for a short period of time, was Georgia's colonial agent, something that Wright didn't necessarily like. Not because he had anything against Ben Franklin, but how the Georgia legislature finagled the position. In fact, Wright and Ben Franklin knew each other when Wright was in London from 1757 to 1760. They lived 2 doors down from one another, and they were involved in some lobbying about the rice trade together in 1758 or so. So that's what he did before he became governor of Georgia.
And so he was appointed not lieutenant governor. He was appointed when Henry Ellis, I guess, either stepped down or just wanted to get out of Georgia. He was appointed to replace him. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's an interesting story. Henry Ellis, who was Georgia's second colonial governor and an incredibly competent individual, he was struggling with the weather, the humidity of which you know so well, and wrote a letter, to his administrators back in London, and said he wanted to take leave. And they quickly responded. They granted him his leave, and then he realized that, wait a minute, I want to come back. I just want a temporary leave because I'm not feeling well. And then they didn't give him that opportunity. And so they had appointed James Wright lieutenant governor. So you correctly spoke there. That's the process. Lieutenant governor, and then upon his arrival and his meeting with Henry Ellis, then that change from lieutenant governor to governor would take place.
Mm-hmm. So he comes in 1760, and really the first 4 years or so, as you mentioned, he was really probably considered incredibly successful. Administrator, representative of the crown. You mentioned that he negotiated with the indigenous people of Georgia who ceded some land. This was seen as a real boon. He was, I think, very popular with the people of Georgia until 1765. Is that right?
Yeah, the Stamp Act interrupted the honeymoon. He was very, again, as I said, acquisitive. He wanted Georgia's economy to grow. He aligned himself very quickly with the planter class, and was a judicious and a fair-minded representative of the crown. Now, no mistakes to be made. He represented the crown, but at the same time, he believed that he also had this dual loyalty, that he also had to represent the people of Georgia as best as he could within the parameters set forth by the crown and through British mercantilism, which was their imperialist model at the time.
Hmm. One of the things that I thought you did remarkably well, and you do it right out of the bat, really, in chapter one, you mentioned his extensive land holdings and the fact that he owned human beings, and he owned a
Hmm.
lot of them.
Hmm.
In fact, you say, this is a quote from page 18, Wright enslaved hundreds of human beings, and their daily toil and sufferings must be at the forefront of every discussion of his role in slavery.
Yeah. Um, yes, and one of the most frustrating things for me was that's there's just so little left in the record to tell me about him, and his plantations. Again, if we go to the Loyalist claims, the paperwork he filed to receive indemnification after the war, he identifies each enslaved person at both 1776 when he's kicked out, and then when he's kicked out for good in 1782. He identifies a monetary value next to their name. And for some of them, he identifies a role they played on the plantation. But that's it. There's really nothing. It is very accounting specific in terms of how he uh, discussed his enslaved human beings. And I didn't want to. I'm glad you mentioned that because it's a touchy topic, because I didn't want to, because the record didn't provide me much. I didn't want to eschew and kind of look over that. But at the same time, I really have to look at all the other clues that I can to find out what kind of, gosh, what kind of enslaver he was. I know that's a terrible way to put that, but um, as I tell my students, and I teach high school, as I tell my students, slavery was different from plantation to plantation, from town to town, from region of the country to region of the country, across time, uh, and then across positions within the plantation. And so, um, trying to ascertain whether he was a more patriarchal enslaver, or if he was, gosh, someone like a James Covey that made from Frederick Douglass's autobiography,
Hmm.
someone
Hmm.
who was just very ruthless. And Wright, as best I can understand through letters, mostly from James Habersham and Henry Lawrence, Wright seemed to be a patriarchal enslaver. At the same time, he was an enslaver, and he was hands off in most of the day to day operations outside of um, uh, instructing his overseers, with how to operate the business side of his plantations. I'll give you a quick example. I may be rambling here for a second, but a quick example is James Habersham wrote to a merchant in London, and he's ordering clothing for his enslaved population. And he says James Wright would also like something better than the typical enslaved clothing. And I'm looking at that and I'm thinking, okay, that could mean that he's trying to care for them more gingerly. It could just simply mean that he wants a higher quality clothing so that it lasts longer. It could be that he wants to provide them with higher quality clothing so that they are more endeared to him. It could be something of all of the above. It doesn't have to be one or the other. This is a complex situation. And then I read Betty Wood, the great historian of slavery and of slavery in the colonial era and Georgia. She wrote a great book called Slavery in Colonial Georgia. And she mentioned that it was an out. I don't want to misquote her. Something to the effect of it was an outstanding enslaver who purchased his clothing for his slave property from London rather than preparing it locally or buying it locally. And so those are the kind of things that all that I can really say about him as an enslaver, other than that he continually purchased human beings. He continually sought local legislation that protected the institution. And at the forefront of his mind, when he thought he was going to lose his properties in Georgia, were that the loyalists be repaid for their loss in slave property. Um, and that was again at the forefront of his loyalist commission's report, was that that all loyalist enslavers be repaid. So that's maybe a long answer to your question, but
Not at all. Not at all. I think, you did it very nuanced in the book. You recognized the humanity of the enslaved without really being able to tell us much about his relationship to them. It is, as you say, a very touchy subject, particularly now, of course, both in scholarship and in the world at large. Let's move on to the revolution, because this is sort of the heart of the book. As you mentioned, the honeymoon came to an end in the Stamp Act crisis, and over the next 15 years, really from 1765 to 1780 and beyond, 82 when he left. This is when everything came unraveled for James Wright. But still, he never at any point, and this the subtitle of your book mentions the price of loyalty in Georgia. So take a moment here and take us through the revolution in Georgia. He is credited with being the one person who sort of forestalled the revolution in Georgia. The radicalism that engulfed other places did not do so here, and he's often given credit for it. But at the same time, he paid a heavy price for it in the end.
Right. As we said, the honeymoon came crashing to an end in 1765 with the passage of the Stamp Act, which brought a great deal of violence to some areas north of Georgia. Certainly Boston and New York and Philadelphia come to mind first and foremost for all of us. But there was a Stamp Act movement here in Georgia as well, with a group of men that he called the Sons of Licentiousness, not the Sons of Liberty, but the Sons of Licentiousness. And he was able to navigate that crisis by being the only colonial governor to issue stamps during the crisis. Now, again, what he issued was nominal, but the fact that that he maintained his power, that he maintained a still positive relationship with Georgians after 1765 is really important. It shows a great deal about his ability to lead. Now, having said that, that was, prior to the Stamp Act, was the apex of his career in Georgia. Things would slowly degenerate. Georgians, especially those outside of his royal council, and this happened elsewhere as well. It happened in Georgia later, but Georgia was a younger colony. Started to sow their oats a bit, started to realize that they had more power than they may have thought they had before the Stamp Act crisis. They realized that they, as a group of people, colonial-wide, were able to protest and then have redress given to them. They were able to have the Stamp Act repealed. A tenuous peace from 1766 to about 1770, and in that process, during that time, the Townshend Acts are repealed, or passed and then repealed. James Wright, one thing I do want to mention, I've just skipped over, is that he wrote his ministers back in London during the Stamp Act crisis, specifically at the Stamp Act repeal, that he thought the repeal was a terrible decision. I liken it to a parent telling their child, no, you can't do this. And the child cries long enough, and the parent finally gives in. And what does that teach the child? That if I continue to do this and exhibit this behavior, I'll get what I want eventually. And that's essentially what he told ministerial officials in 1766. So this tenuous peace, he still held in regard, but something has changed. I would imagine a greater than half of the population has now realized that his first loyalties lie with the king. And again, he's a true 18th century British conservative. He believes in order. He believes in law and order. In fact, he chastises the rebellious Georgians for their disregard of the law, and says that if you want these changes, of which I think some of these changes are worthwhile that you seek, the way to go about them is through legal methods, not through rioting and such. In fact, he says that you guys liken yourself to being sons of liberty, but those who follow the law are those who truly enjoy liberty. And again, he finds himself by 1773, by the Tea Party, he finds himself out of step with I'm not going to say most Georgians, because I'm not sure that most Georgians ever would ever sided with the patriot cause at any given time.
Mm-hmm.
Georgia witnessed a really terrible civil war throughout the American Revolution, and people chose loyalty to the British Crown, or the patriot Whig philosophy, oftentimes based on who was in the neighborhood. What group controlled the neighborhood, physically controlled the neighborhood. Sometimes it was, for ideological reasons, but it was a bloody battle back and forth, and he was caught up in the middle of it and had no idea how to navigate it. He just couldn't understand how Georgians could ever rebel against the king. It just didn't make sense to him.
Yeah. And so you mentioned earlier the Battle of the Rice Boat. So in early 1776, he's basically forced physically out of Savannah onto a British warship in the river. And he is absent from Georgia again until sometime early, I think, in 1780, I think. Is that right? No, 1779, I guess. He came back, right?
Late 79 or July 79.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he's captured by the son of his best friend. James Habersham died shortly before the revolution began. His son Joseph arrested him in January of 1776. He was imprisoned in his house on parole, forbidden to speak to any British officials then at on the dock or at bay in Savannah. He was threatened with death. He was physically and verbally threatened and assaulted. And finally, by February, he decides he is going to effect his escape in the middle of the night. And he and his daughters do so. In the escape, or shortly after the escape, it is discovered that he's escaped. A battle of the rice boats unfolds, which is never going to see any notice in a typical history of the American Revolution. A, because it's Georgia, and Georgia is often forgotten in the Revolution. But B, it's a skirmish. It's a skirmish, but it's a skirmish that ended up destroying all of his personal and whatever professional paperwork he had in his chests on the boat that was following him to the British ship in the harbor.
So is it is it safe to assume that this is still lying on the bottom of the Savannah River?
I would think so. I mean, whatever condition it's in, right?
Yeah, whatever conditions it's in. That's where it happened, right? It happened
Yeah.
out here on the Savannah River.
Yes.
And just geographically, where his house was in Savannah?
His house in Savannah was on the location of the Telfair Museum.
Right.
So the modern day Telfair Museum is where his house was located, and it was called the Governor's House.
Mm-hmm. And the square at that time was known as, was that St. James Square? Is that what it was called?
St. James, yes.
Yeah. Okay. And not there now, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
So from this point on, we know that the British recaptured Savannah in December of 1778. He comes back to reclaim his position as governor in what is really, from that point on, sort of a besieged city. We know that the Americans tried to take it again in the Siege of Savannah with their allies in October 1779.
Mm-hmm.
Unsuccessfully, but really from that point on, it's just a matter of time, right, before the British are sort of forced out at that point. Walk us through the rest of that for us.
Okay, well, he comes back, as you said, in the summer of 1779. Not necessarily eagerly, but he certainly volunteered to do so. He comes back. He is promised by Lord George Germain from England that the province is just waiting for his arrival, and things are going to be great again. He presents this rosy picture, and Wright, I'm not sure Wright got off the ship before he sent back his first letter, essentially calling Germain a liar. This is not what I'm encountering. He knew immediately that this city was was teeming with people of all different political persuasions. Um, he immediately finds himself in a besieged city as the British or as the American rebels and their French allies um, under Count d'Estaing lay siege to the city for roughly a month. His son is wounded during the siege. The siege is a awfully bloody affair. It is I think considered to be the second bloodiest battle in the American Revolution outside of Bunker Hill. Which, if anybody knows the Revolution, they know Bunker Hill. The fighting there was bloody indeed. Wright plays a fairly conspicuous part in the defense of Savannah, in that he urged the British to not surrender the city, even if it meant he lost everything. He said he would rather defend the city and lose everything he has than give the city up and maybe find some kind of peace back in England. To whatever extent that may be true, it's hard to tell. Sometimes with 18th century sources, there's some braggadocio, and sometimes early 19th century historians, portray events a little bit differently than they were. Just like historians of every generation, we interpret the past through the present. But officers at the time in the British lines praised him without hesitation and unanimously. His loyalist claims are filled with affidavits from British officers during the siege of Savannah praising his conduct. But then after that, that's the highlight for him after he returns. By January, and the siege ends in October of 1779, and by January he's crying for help. We're being run over again. There aren't nearly as many loyalists here as we had hoped, or they are here, but they don't feel they can be protected, so they have to state that they are, sharing their allegiances with the rebels, because allegiances in South Carolina and in Georgia during this time period, as I mentioned earlier, often depended upon whichever side could protect them. And so he harangues the British ministry for their failure to protect Georgia's loyalists. And in defense maybe of the British ministry, they believed that Georgia was safe, or wanted to believe it, and then acted as if it was true. And then immediately went to South Carolina, where they laid siege to Charleston and took Charleston. And then, the rest is history. But once the British leave Savannah, in most numbers, like they left a few men behind, but once they left Savannah after the siege of Savannah, there was no chance that Savannah was going to be held.
Yeah. And so once Yorktown happens in October 1781, at that point, really the negotiations begin in Europe, and for the end of the Revolution. The British evacuate Charleston and they evacuate Savannah in the summer, July, I think, of 1782. So for the last time, James Wright is aboard ship. He crosses the bar at Tybee, and he never sees Georgia or South Carolina again. And the last couple of years really are sort of tragic. I mean, you've mentioned that he's I think he's the chair, he's the head of the Loyalist Commission, trying to get financial compensation for the great loss, not just for himself, but for everybody, for all Americans. So do you feel like that he dies in exile? Was he okay living in London? Did he feel like Georgia was his home, or was this just an appointment that he served the king, that he was okay being there? I've never been able to quite get my hand around that.
It's a great question. He was, and most loyalists, I think, felt exiled. They had no home, like, where they lived and grew up, they were kicked out of, and people in England thought of them as strangers.
Right.
But for James Wright, he has a different scenario. And he, I believe, was tortured by a dual loyalism. He had loyalty to both, and he had good friends in both. And so his exile, if you will, was certainly much easier than maybe anybody else. But it nonetheless was painful. I mean, he nearly lost his life. His daughter, one of his daughters, and his son-in-law were captured at sea during the siege of Savannah and were imprisoned in Paris. He had two sons that fought in the war. One that was injured. One of his brothers was killed by the rebels during the Revolution in a skirmish outside of Jacksonville. And so it was a difficult war. I mean, it was a tough war for him. He lost all of his property, both in humans, but in the value of all of the his personal wealth, which the Loyalist Commission deemed to be about £100,000 at the end of the war. So he was a wealthy man who lost it all. He was given payment for 33,000 pounds of that, and an annuity as a former governor. But the war killed him. He died at a fairly young age, certainly for someone so affluent. He died in his 60s. And I think just worn down by the war, the travel back and forth, the imprisonment, the concern over his family, siege of Savannah, and then the Loyalist Commission in his final years. He worked tirelessly to not just fill his own claims, but to sign affidavits for hundreds upon hundreds of other Georgians and South Carolinians who remained loyal to the king but had then been banished. And so one thing, just real quick before we finish that point, is that one tidbit that I get about his personal character. Three men file a Loyalist claim, and in their Loyalist claim, they say that when they got to London, they again felt like strangers in a strange town, and were treated as such, and they were destitute. And they went to George Wright, and he gave them money that lasted them, a decent while, according to them. And so that that opens up a little bit of light into who he was as a person, as did the restless, tireless work he did for the Loyalist Commission.
Yeah. And you mentioned he died, I think, in November 1785. So just really 3 years, I guess, after he got back, after he left Georgia, 69 years old, I think. And almost he is buried in Westminster Abbey. And when we hear that, we think, there's some prestige there, but I don't think it's out of the realm to say really kind of forgotten about by both sides, right? The Georgians, for whom he had acted in their interest for so long, didn't care much about him at that point, and Great Britain buried him and sort of moved on. The empire in America was gone, and the servants who served so well were forgotten about. Is that correct to say that?
I think that's fair. Both the American rebels, patriots, they wanted to look past him immediately. They tried endlessly to arrest him after he returned to Georgia, and to exchange him in prisoner exchanges so that he could be dealt with properly by them. So they had no love lost, certainly. And then after the war ended, those in England wanted to forget it as quickly as they could. In fact, he was buried in Westminster in a very obscure place. It took my wife and I about an hour and a half to find his spot in Westminster Abbey, and that was with the help of the staff there. No one
I was going to ask you if you'd been there.
Yeah, no one could ever really figure out where it was, and we were only able to find out that the spot we were looking at was by using paper and pencil to scratch over the markings on the floor to see that it was actually James Wright. Yeah, it was so faded.
And do you know how he came to be buried there? Was it his wish? Do you know how that happened?
I imagine it was because he was granted a baronetcy. I would imagine that entitled him to that. And after the war, his baronetcy, of course, passed to his son, James Wright Jr. And then by 1815, I think, if Ken Thomas's, my memory of Ken Thomas's words are correct, the title was gone. There was nobody left no descendants left to kind of claim that.
So we remember him here in Georgia, I think, through there's no Wright County, but there's a Wrightsville. right? And
Hmm.
correct, and it's named for him. Hmm.
Yes, yes,
And
that's true.
a Wright Square here in Savannah.
Yes, yeah.
Hmm. Don't know how he'd feel about that, knowing that it's out
Right.
of the empire now. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think it's safe to say, Greg, that really through this through your book, which is just it's a yeoman piece of craftsmanship of history, that you were able to do what so many before you were not able to do, as you said. But you sort of rescued, I think, one of Georgia's great public servants from an undeserved obscurity, if you will.
Yeah, I thank you for saying that. I hope that I was able to shed light on somebody that was really so important to Georgia in its formative years, but that had, as you say, kind of been forgotten. In fact, oh gosh, don't quote me now. Um, Someone, and I can't remember if it's a primary or secondary source. Again, it's been a year since I've looked at James Wright. Um, Said that James Wright was the true father of colonial Georgia, not James Oglethorpe.
Mm,
And there's
mm.
a and it was a respected person, and it's in my book. I just can't remember exactly who said it at the moment.
Yeah. Wow. Really quickly, I just want to ask you about process. You mentioned your day job as a high school teacher. So
Hmm.
tell me how and when you wrote this book. How were you able to work on it?
Slowly. Teaching high school is a long job. It is a tiring job.
Hmm.
Nothing like a group of teenagers to suck your energy out of you during a day, which is a good thing. That's what I'm there for, and I love doing it. Um, but it made then coming home and researching, more difficult.
Hmm.
I was fortunate to earn several fellowships to research at places, and I spent most spring breaks and good chunks of summers writing and researching in various places, and then finishing up the writing of the last few years during those times. So that in that sense, it's great that I was a teacher, not some other occupation which doesn't have the time off as I get as a teacher.
Hmm.
Um, but it has required a good deal of focus and discipline to do it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Do you write in the morning? Did you write at night after a long day?
Mostly it would be during the afternoon and at night. Now during spring breaks or summers, it would be I'd wake up and just come to my office and spend all day here.
Hmm.
And you have to take advantage of summers and spring breaks and Christmas breaks and those things.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you care to mention what you're working on now, or is that state secret?
No, sure. I am currently working on a biography of a friend of James Wright who became enemy, Henry Lawrence.
Mm.
I am very deep into the research there. I've got a few more fellowships coming up here in the spring and the summer, and I hope to be finished with the research, knock on wood, by the end of summer. But that just means that it will probably be the following summer before I am finished, because there's not a rabbit hole that I haven't loved diving into.
Well, that's something that the world has needed for a very long time. I think the last biography of him was 1915.
Yeah,
Wow.
the only cradle to grave kind of biography was written by Henry Duncan Wallace, or
Hmm.
David Duncan Wallace,
Hmm.
like you said, during World War One. And James McDonough wrote a comparative Revolutionary War biography of Henry Lawrence and Christopher Gadsden about 20 years ago.
Hmm.
So I'm hoping that mine will be able to kind of resuscitate Henry Lawrence on a national level rather than just the regional level he holds in South Carolina.
Absolutely. Well, that's a book I'm looking forward to reading in another podcast that we're going to do. Well,
There we
Greg
go.
Brooking, congratulations on the publication of this book. Everything that all the accolades are well deserved. It fills an important niche, not only in Georgia history, but I think in the history of the American Revolution. So, congratulations, and thank you for coming on to talk about it.
Thank you very much. And I wanted to say before I go, thank you for all of your support over the last decade, because you were there literally at the beginning when the project was conceived, and you've always been a cheerleader in my corner. And so that's very much appreciated.
Well, thanks, Greg. I appreciate it. Thanks for coming on. My thanks to Greg Brooking for joining me on this podcast. You can find out more about his book at ugapress.org. The hardest working producer and engineer in show business, the producer of this podcast, the czar of our Tallahassee office, as well as the captain of the GHS ear-pulling team, is our very own and indispensable Brendan Cannonball Crellin. The captain of the GHS Italian wine tasting team is Rebecca PBR Brettina. Our GHS bouncer is Greg the Enforcer and all-around good guy Durkin. All guest accommodations on Off the Beaten Path provided by the Horseshoe Road Inn. The director of the GHS Civil War Beard Division is Nate Brickwall Jackson Peterson. Our Off the Beaten Path fact checker is Ella Fino. The GHS Director of Accounts Payable is Bill Schroeder. The Off the Beaten Path stock market predictor is Luigi Board. The GHS table saw operator is Les Digits. Our Director of Employee Loyalty is Upton Leftus. Our staff layoff specialist is Harry Verderci, assisted by layoff counselor Oscar LaVista. Our insurance claims liaison is Royal Payne Diaz. Our customer care specialist is Begonia Payne Diaz. Our complaints coordinator is Stella Payne Diaz, and our gastroenterologist is Cameron Diaz. The official Off the Beaten Path cheese expert is Gordon Zola. The GHS Summer Wardrobe Consultant is Bermuda Schwartz. Our Staff Director of Three Stooges Studies is Lee Iapoca. Dr. Todd Gross's personal eBay specialist is Selma Junkoff. And our Off the Beaten Path martini mixer, thank you very much, is Olive Twist. You can find our podcast anywhere you can find podcasts, including now on YouTube and YouTube Music. You can find out everything about the Georgia Historical Society at georgiahistory.com and the Georgia History Festival at georgiahistoryfestival.org. Be sure and like Off the Beaten Path on Facebook as well. Please also visit deatonpath.georgiahistory.com and check out our videos called Dispatches from Off the Beaten Path, my blog, and similar high price of loyalty podcasts like this one. Stay safe, stay strong. I'm Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society. As always, thank you for listening.